Hello again. How are you all doing? Fantastic to have a really wide range of different expertise in the panel, and I think actually what we're trying to achieve today is something that everyone can join in and be involved with. Some of the topics we'll discuss I think will be futuristic and conceptual, but the opportunity you have here to dig into any of the points you'd like at the end I think is a really good opportunity. I wanted to take just a very few moments to pass the mic down, let everyone give a brief introduction of themselves to add to the ones before. Would you like to start?
Yeah. Hey, I'm Andy. I lead ML at NetData Cloud. We do observability, monitoring metrics, open source, and we're trying to use ML in our product, all of our products.
Hi everybody, Jason Grant. I'm an account executive at NVIDIA. I work within the CSP and telco space. I've got a very keen interest into this event because I've been working alongside Civo for many years actually, predominantly on the networking side, but more recently also working with Deep Green, helping develop and build the proof of concept for what the product that was launched yesterday. So it's a really exciting time for us.
Hello everyone, my name is Tatiana. I'm CEO and founder of Minticode. Minticode is a decentralized API marketplace for software creators. We help software creators to monetize their contribution to open source because open source developers are not fairly paid for their work. In addition to that, I'm CTO and co-founder of Deriskly, a powered solution for smart communications.
Hi everyone, I'm Dan Lewis, so I'm the Director of Growth at Rockborn. So I've got a background in people, talent and culture, and we're basically set up to try and launch the careers of an increasingly diverse talent pool and close the shortage by helping to develop people, but also helping to guide companies on how to actually create development pathways to progress people through the organization into leadership roles.
Thank you very much. So let's get kicked off, I think, into the first question. And what we're trying to do here is actually dig into some of the underlying points and try and get the industry viewpoint from across everyone with their diverse backgrounds. So I think the first thing we should really talk about is generative AI, and actually how generative AI is shaping the way we work and the way we interact with each other on a day-by-day basis. So a recent Forbes survey actually figured this number at 44% of businesses are currently using generative AI for their content. And actually 46% of those businesses are using them for internal companies' communications. I think the interesting part of this is actually on a day-by-day basis, people are going to bump into artificially generated content and human-generated content. And that will be a change in what people do on a day-by-day basis on the web, books, music, etc. I think to kick off, it'd be really interesting to hear about how that could impact in your areas, actually, what we should do to make sure that these tools and technologies can be used for good in that case. Does anyone want to take?
Josh, I'm going to take that mic. You're all mic.
Fantastic, thank you. Does anyone want to take that to start?
I can start from a practical point of view, trying to build ML in a company, and it's in the observability space in general. And we're trying to figure out, we had a roadmap of ML products we wanted to build, and I'm trying to figure out now, okay, which of them need to be scrapped versus, let's just go double down on, chat LLMs ourselves. I'm on the fence about, you need to be very careful about not getting too carried away with ourselves, because actually in the last 5+ years, getting ML into production has become much more easier. Before we had these large language models, and now with the large language models, it's actually gotten harder and more complicated. So while they might be like game changers if you do the right thing, they're a lot harder to get into production, they're a lot harder to kind of monitor. It's still very early on and kind of understanding what the best practices are. So it's a tricky one now, in terms of, okay, which parts of the ML roadmap do we just stay the course and then we run the risk of, okay, well, we don't have a fancy, chatbot that we can shout about, but actually we're building actual ML features. It's a trade-off, So we're kind of trying to do a little bit of both, but take a sort of a nuanced approach because it's tricky.
I think just to dig into that a bit more are you letting your users know if the content you're giving them is generated content?
Yeah, so one particular, we do have like a Net Data Assistant, which is our first kind of step here, and it's to do with alerts. So like in the alert troubleshooting, within our product we have a lot of like education about, we have lots of metrics and like what do they mean. So similar with alerts, we have kind of generative AI, we have a mix of like domain expertise, so every single alert has like a troubleshooting guide that goes with it, and that's being kind of augmented now by LLM, ChatGPT type content as well, and we've kind of merged it all together, and that then it's pretty clear in the product, yes, this is the Net Data Assistant and it's generative AI, and it doesn't really, it's a one-way thing, it's not yet two-way, it's still sort of one-way based on the alert you're looking at, it'll generate the kind of specific context, but it's not yet two-way yet, so that'll be the next step, and that's what to be careful about.
I think that's interesting because it's not just about informing, it's about receiving as well alongside that. Jason, it'd be really interesting to get your viewpoint, I think, from NVIDIA.
Sure, and I always think back whenever we talk about generative AI to a recent speech from Jensen, our CEO, and he called generative AI the iPhone moment of AI. And it really is, because suddenly everybody knows about ChatGPT, and it's kind of synonymous with what people do today. I mean, I use ChatGPT to feed my LinkedIn bio, and it gave me my bio for today's session. So, I mean, it doesn't matter who you speak to, what industry they work in, everybody's heard of ChatGPT, everybody's using it. It is becoming ubiquitous in today's environment. And obviously that's driving a huge amount of innovation, huge amount of change and demand for additional services. I think we're at quite a pivotal moment, but we're really only at the start of the journey. You kind of see the hype curve, and we're kind of going on the upside of that. There's a lot more to come. Jensen's very visionary. He's looking at 12, 24, 48 months in advance, and some of the innovation that's going to come out of it is just going to be mind-blowing. We can't even think about it today, but yeah, generative AI is definitely changing the way we interact with the world.
That's really interesting, actually. Tatiana, you have a company that faces off directly to the people who could be building these things. We're just going to get your viewpoint about how we're going to manage this almost perception of generated content by artificial intelligence and the content we will see that is human-generated.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I started my research around 5 years ago. That's when I learned about natural language processing, and then the way in which this area advanced, it amuses me, so that's fascinating. What I found interesting is that right now we still don't understand whether AI understands what it generates, right? So my area of research is called explainable artificial intelligence, where we're trying to find metrics, evaluation techniques and methods. How do we evaluate if if AI understands and can explain generated text? And the main problem, so my area of research is applied, machine learning applied to high-stake domains, especially legal domain, because I was a lawyer before. And before 5 years ago, it was it was impossible to imagine that AI could replace a lawyer. But nowadays, there are news when generated text was used in court judgments. Also recent research showed that actually AI was able to even pass a bar exam in a very successful way. So I think there are, of course, a lot of challenges, and it's really difficult to right now to actually make a difference between AI-generated content and human-generated content, and we know that right now there is no any, I would say, tool that can predict the accuracy of the prediction if it was AI-generated or human-generated text, and that's a problem. And another biggest challenge is that we know that big language models, they hallucinate It means that they create facts that never existed, and these facts, they look and they sound like real, and that's especially very dangerous in such fields as law or healthcare, when it can generate text and explanations that are not actually real. And I think the main challenge here, what is interesting, is that this model is generative model, right? So what it means that the model is designed to just predict the sequence of tokens. And that's the goal of the model. I think right now we just need to explore other ways. What type of models can we build to solve different type of tasks? And the way at which I just believe that generative AI is only one of models and methods that can help in different industries, but we should not rely entirely on, I would say, generative models.
So these are really, really good points there, actually. I think to take it to a very different perspective, actually, Dan, from an education and training point of view, and actually how you get the next generation of AI to start to think about these problems whilst they're building, what do you think is the most ergonomic way to make sure people understand the importance of some of these pieces?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and I think at the moment it's at a place where certainly my own personal experience trying to use generative AI tools, it's this kind of human interaction which makes it quite difficult to use sometimes if you're from a non-technical background. And what I mean by that is there's this lens of you have to, in the case of ChatGPT, you have to ask it a question, and then it gives you back you have to put a prompt in. And so the things that you're talking about when you're saying, that you can create very high quality content, it's because the person asking the prompt knows how it works and knows how to ask that prompt. It's like we've all helped our grandparents Google things. But the problem is people will prompt naturally differently, and people won't have an appetite to want to learn the right way to prompt because they want it to work like a conversation, just like speaking to someone who's far more enlightened than them. And that's one of the challenges that I see overcoming, and that's going to impact the uptake and the demand on the market. And so until it becomes, I guess, a kind of a federated skill set, like having Excel or Microsoft Word skills or something like that, I think it's always going to sit within a niche, which makes it difficult to scale. Because, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of used to, I grew up with technology, clearly, unlike my grandparents' generation. Even I will put in some questions and get some, I use it for research quite a lot when I'm researching companies. It saves me hours, it's fantastic. But even then, I validated it against our own business, and actually there was tons of errors in there, and that made me think, hang on, before I'm going to sit down with, C-suite of this enterprise company, I probably need to get the results back and then still check the sources it gives you and all sorts of other things. So I think until it's kind of like out of that Wikipedia territory, if you understand what I mean, of like, is it trusted or not? Can I, did I ask, is it me? Is it my fault? I think it's going to be difficult to adopt at scale.
So there's some really interesting points there. What I see in common amongst everyone is actually that the spotlight is here right now. Generative AI seems to be where the front row seats are right now in AI, enterprise adoption alongside developer adoption. I think actually a point that both I think Andrew and Tatiana raised is the input matters, and actually could the machine learning model be hallucinating? And the accuracy is actually one of the more important parts about why you'd want to make sure you told people it was generated content as opposed to human generated content. I think something interesting that we all touched on there is people are quite happy to put their name next to generated content right now. I think that's also an interesting part where you're putting your personal accountability and opinion onto generative content. And I think the interesting part of rounding that out was we had both, does the AI understand that content, but also, do I understand that content? And I think those are interesting things to look at when we're creating generative content and putting it out towards communities. I'll jump into the next question, I think follows into that quite closely. And I think the really important part about this is actually how we make sure that this content is understood and perceived from a policy perspective alongside from a technical perspective. So last week, The Guardian reported on, I think it was 8 UK MPs who were protesting against a bill that was being submitted where music, books, and I believe ebooks as well would be classified as public domain if they were being used in machine learning training sets. And actually, that opens up a really interesting conversation, copyright versus access to use. And is training data something that we have to declare a lineage around? I think it's becoming a really interesting question. There's a few ways to solve this that I think we should try and investigate. I think one is declaring training data. The other one might be around, is the data you're training the model really the challenge here, having access to that data? I'll pick on Jason first. I think it'd be good to get it from the video perspective.
Yeah, so, and it's a great point. I mean, it's an often asked question. Obviously, we sit fairly low level. We build the hardware that drives a lot of this. But yeah, a very common question. I mean, obviously, I can't talk to copyright law. I'll defer to Tatiana for that. However, I think what's really driving a lot of the demand, and you probably have to live under a rock not to see the demand that's being created around the hardware that supports these models, is a lot of organizations have recognized that, and they're also concerned about their intellectual property being available on the open market. And we also have internal guidance on how we can use generative AI inside of NVIDIA as well. So it's recognized by us internally. So what we're seeing is a drive towards private GPT models. If we use ChatGPT as an example, the same applies across all generative AI, whether it be image, vision, etc. But yeah, we're seeing a push towards more private. So you'll see, for example, a Barclays GPT, or you may well have heard of Brit GPT, which the UK government has invested, I think it's 100 million, in developing a Brit GPT model. So you're going to see a rise in private GPTs where the data is held within the organization and it's trained on intellectual property that that organization owns and only that organization has access to. And that's really what is starting to drive a lot of this demand, because training of these models is expensive, both in time and resource. I think we did a calculation, and ChatGPT-3, I think it was about $10 million to do a single training run of ChatGPT-3 inside of a hyperscaler. And clearly, you never do just one training run, right? These are iterative models. So it is expensive. People recognize that they have to protect their data, but they have to do it in a cost-effective manner. So it's finding that balance.
Interesting, I think, actually. And we'll circle back to, I think, a few of those private GPT points. Tatiana, since he passed across to you, I'd love to know what you think about how the data and the model need to be classified and almost declared. Do you think there's a possibility in the future we'll see auditing of machine learning models?
Yeah, I think what is interesting here is about, I would like to also address the point about copyrighted work, right, and intellectual property. What is interesting here is that, how these models are used and who owns this data. And here the problem here that there is a gap, so I would say there are companies, they have sufficient resources, right, to train these models, and there are creators, individual creators, who collectively contributed to this training data set. And at the time when they signed their rights to train to do something with their data, they could not even imagine that this data could be used to train very powerful AI models. And as a result, for example, it's very interesting with books and generated content, but what is more interesting is with generated code. I'm frequently asked, will AI replace software engineers, right? The short answer is no, because we know that GPT-4 can solve coding tasks with only 70% accuracy, so it's even lower than passing bar exams. So for language models, it's easier to solve, I would say, to become a lawyer than to become a software engineer. But what is interesting when you contribute to open source, for example, right? You contribute to open source, you don't expect that this data will be used to train a very powerful AI generated model. You contribute to open source, you make it free under MIT, for example, license that anyone can use and distribute modifications to your code. But then companies that train these models, they start earning money from using, from utilizing, I would say, the access to resources they had. For example, what is interesting here about, there are two approaches, right, to that. And in case of OpenAI, it's completely commercial product. In case of Meta, it's Llama model, it's open source and free, but it's not exactly open source because in their license, there is a condition that if you will file a lawsuit against Meta, asserting your intellectual property rights to the content that was used for training the data, you are no longer allowed to use their language model. So there are a lot of questions. Who can benefit from using these language models and who can get access to this revenue generated from utilizing these language models. And of course, with respect to further development of large language models, we need to think about different models where if it was trained using public data, the access to the public should be free. That's my opinion.
That's one thing about the data. There's two kind of slices to think about this. So there's the data that trains like the foundational models, the big, messy, and there's going to be a load of stuff to figure out there for sure. But the data that's going to make products that we're all going to use is actually often much smaller sets of really rich and focused, niche, narrow data sets. And that's where like companies can have, if you have like the best source of, I was watching a talk by Andrew Ng and he was, it's a pizza manufacturing company that has, pictures of pizzas and defect comments and notes. That doesn't exist anywhere in the world. They're the only ones who have that, and that's what's going to train the best automated pizza detection quality control system on top of, a base foundational image model. And so there's a separation, like there's the layer of, higher, more focused, rich data that goes on top. And that's where like most of the value can be. And then there for sure is the foundational models with the big data sets. That needs to be figured out for sure.
I always hammer that point home, right? It's about domain experts are experts in their domain, machine learning experts are experts in machine learning. And I think actually one of the hardest roles you can have is trying to intersect those two, help those two sides come together. And I think that's where the most powerful machine learning models come from. And it's probably why in the last talk you can see people doing a couple of $100 million worth of machine learning research for a couple of £100. I think it comes from standing on the shoulders of that. I want to pick on Dan here because Dan spends a lot of time interfacing between clients and machine learning problems. It'd be good to get a rounding comment from you on the question.
Well, if we're talking about, I suppose, the interfacing between, in an enterprise environment, there's what we refer to as domain experts, and then if we put, technical experts in another bucket, I think there's going to be there already is a demand. We look at the data space most is where we spend most of our time, and I can see this consistently. There's a demand for someone to let technical people do what they do really well, but add value to the business. And where a lot of breakdown in communications within organizations comes is when you're asking people to do things that are outside of their skill set and their strength. So I think there's a role in the middle. It's not rocket science, and it does exist in other organizations, but it doesn't exist consistently across every team, across every kind of, environment where this kind of friction occurs, is to get more funding, to do more cool stuff, to recruit more people, to invest in more technology. You need to be adding value to someone somewhere, most likely, who doesn't want to hear the detail. So actually, how can you create a process whereby you're empowering the technical people to really flourish and do what they do and not get bogged down in the politics and in the pounds and pennies and all that kind of thing, but also to make the people who don't want to see the detail feel like they're investing in the right things and they're adding value. And that's for us, we're starting to see a lot more people talking about these kind of interface roles, so individuals who might wear multiple hats, and that's their specialism. So if you think, in an insurance company, they might have a technical team who runs their database, runs their environments, and you might have a business stakeholder who's an insurance expert, knows that industry inside out. Ideally, where it works really well is you have someone in the middle who can talk both languages, but maybe without as much depth. And that's something that everyone that I've spoken to one-to-one, like, do you have people like this? They go, well, kind of. We've maybe our POs do that. And it's like, well, or I'll speak to a director of engineering, and they go, well, that's my role. And it's like, yeah, but you've got all this other stuff to do as well. So already you're now the bottleneck for these sorts of conversations. And if you go on annual leave for 2 weeks, you kind of shudder to think, is someone going to say something that they shouldn't? So I think on that kind of, it's a slight tangent, but on that sort of trend, I think from my conversations I've had in my career, you can drag and drop that problem and drop it into any kind of area where business and technical rub up against one another.
I think actually to round up, think ensemble sports. Definitely everyone involved needs to be able to contribute and own the domain that they represent. I think that's the solution to lots of the gaps of knowledge that currently exist. And I think some of the statements we hear about machine learning and data complexity is maybe you don't have the right person in the room who understands the right concepts. I think there's a really good point there about making sure we have an inclusive machine learning and AI industry that takes really wide ranges of thought and puts them together to almost come to consensus between groups of people who probably haven't worked on a project historically before and definitely haven't all worked on a software project before. I think we have a little bit of an opportunity here to widen how we democratize software as software professionals. I'm going to jump into do a relatively rapid fire response to this, and I think we'll pass over to the audience. I think the three big players right now in machine learning and AI end up being academia, industry, and open source. And I can see very much so they're all making their imprints very distinctly, all making a lot of noise, to be fair. How do we make sure we can get these three very different ways of operating to collaborate together? And actually, as the things we need to approach now that are causing blockers to this. I'll pick on you first, Andrew.
Well, I think academia needs to catch up a little bit before industry's going a bit too fast with rushing to deploy these things when we don't have proper, like even talking about hallucinations. Like that's a technical problem to be solved in academia and through heavy research before we can let these things loose, So it's a bit tricky. I think maybe we need to, and then there's also the problem as well with academia. They don't have the scale that the industry has in terms of data and money to throw at the problem. So it's actually a real problem, and a little bit chicken and egg as well. So it's hopefully open source. Like I think what's becoming a little bit more norm is like the big tech companies. They know open source is basically a way for them to have competitive advantage. So it's kind of like open source almost as the bridge between the two. Is the way I think it's kind of playing out at the moment, and it's good for now, but I think it can get complicated for sure.
That's really interesting. I'm going to throw it down to Dan at the end so we break the chain.
Yeah, so I think what I see quite a lot is the difference between pushing boundaries and adding value. Just because you doesn't do something and apply something to a certain problem doesn't mean that you should. So I think absolutely there's a space for, in the worlds of academia and open source, that's absolutely the environment to do cool stuff. Whereas if you take that then into the enterprise world, it has to have a purpose. There has to be a why. Why are we doing this? Why are we investing in this? And why is this a benefit? And so I think it's really cool, the applications of AI, but to make it scalable, it has to be very tactile, very tangible, and it has to have a clear value.
I think that's really interesting. I'd be interested to hear the enterprise viewpoint from the video, particularly around the why they're solving the problem.
Yeah, so I guess it's providing easy access to those tools and capabilities. I mean, from an enterprise perspective, we're seeing definitely a shift towards that desire for sovereign data, for example. That data is becoming more and more valuable, so it has to be in a position where you know where it is, and you can access it and maybe even switch off access to it very rapidly if necessary. But it's trying to, you know, if you look kind of at academia, all of those, they have sort of some quite unique challenges. So there is a real challenge in trying to service those kind of three big players with their own unique challenges, with a kind of common set of capabilities. So you know, that's where the likes of yourselves and obviously working with Deep Green come in. You can effectively provide that abstraction layer and offer those services which are unique to those kind of three distinct verticals you've mentioned.
I think really interesting, and from a parrying point, Tatiana, it'd be good to know what you think from a decentralized startup.
Yeah, so that's very interesting question, and I just, you know, what the main threat and main danger of, I would say, monopoly over large language models is that there are multiple, I would say, restrictions and rules, right, for using large language models, of showing for training, or the way how you use the output of language models. The same applies to any centralized company, you know, whether it's even, for example, while open source is decentralized by nature, right, it's primarily centered around one very centralized platform called GitHub that is controlled by one corporation that also controls large language models. And what is interesting here is, you know, all these companies, they have community guidelines of how to use, for example, how to use GitHub, right, or how to use language models. You are not allowed to use it for to generate hate content or for discrimination or something like that. But what is the most scariest element here is that it's not society that decides what is good and what is bad, right? So it's one company, and it applies to many centralized companies that decide for community what will be a community user policy. And I think that's where there is a power of decentralization, and I really like the concept of decentralized autonomous organization or self-governed entities or type of communities where people can just vote directly. And what is interesting, there is technology right now where you can just vote and your vote will be recorded in distributed ledger, right? So it will be in decentralized database. Nobody can falsify your vote. And I think this we should explore different ways how we can combine this, I would say, decentralized voting, democracy, and this type of, I would say, very dangerous, but at the same time very beneficial for society technologies such as artificial intelligence.
I think that's just a really interesting and good way to conclude. Some really exciting points there. And I think we could actually dig into a few of those questions for a fair few more slots. But let's turn it over to the audience if anyone's got any questions or subjects they'd love to discuss.
Hi, I'm Patrick. Question about regulation of AI, which is very much on the minds of governments around the world. The European Union are bringing forth legislation, I think, in the near future, and the UK will undoubtedly follow. I'd just be very interested to hear the panel's views on how that might impact the whole field, whether it might lead to opportunities that we can't yet see. Thanks very much.
I think an awesome point, and I expect a different answer from everyone here. Would you like to start?
I have less informed opinions on the regulation side, to be honest. I go back and forth every day between like open source everything and only let the big guys do it. And there's definitely something about we need to be careful that like we don't let the big tech companies kind of pull the drawbridge up beside them and have regulation that becomes then too onerous on smaller companies. So I think there is a balance. It definitely, I don't think I can agree that like everything shouldn't be open source by by default, that's a little bit too far extreme. But there's probably some sort of middle, like any of these things, it's like a boring middle of the road solution that we need to just figure out over time slowly, and that's as best as we can do.
Very interesting.
Yeah, I think I mean from what I see, I think regulation is inevitable. It will happen. It happens in every single industry as the industry matures. What that will look like, I guess we don't know at this moment in time. I think that probably talks a little bit back to what we were saying about things like copyright, use of data, who owns that data that's generated. So it is starting to throw up some really interesting challenges, and kind of we've seen governments, so certainly the US government have tried to weigh in on copyright against images that are produced by things like DALL-E, etc. So definitely rumblings are starting to emerge on regulation, but I sort of struggle to see how that, given the openness, and obviously at NVIDIA we're very supportive of open source anyway. That's kind of how our foundation is built upon. Given the openness of AI in general and generative AI specifically, I kind of struggle to see how that regulation is going to apply a common set of rules over a hugely disparate set of data.
That's a really interesting point. Large set of rules, very dynamic and diverse set of data. Tatiana, do you want to pick up on that?
With respect to regulation, I do believe that regulation, unfortunately, will not solve the problem of unauthorized or I would say use of large language models for some illegal, I would say, applications. But what is important here is what do you regulate, right? Do you regulate? Do you ban, for example, use of large language models, or you just regulate, the consequences? And that's where you just, as a regulator, I feel the regulator should first of all define what type of consequences are dangerous to society, then define what is dangerous and what is not allowed, but then technology itself should not be regulated.
I think a really good point, actually. Dan, I'm going to ask you once again to conclude on that one.
It's difficult to go after the actual lawyer on this one, but I mean, just my experience of any kind of regulatory and governance policy is just which side do they fall on? Do they become the police and restrict activity, or is it to empower and provide guide rails to support innovation? And it depends on who's coming up with the policy and how up to date their knowledge of the market is.
I think actually one of the things that I saw all of you touch on, which expands really well into it, is actually there's a lot of global difference in how these policies are being approached. And we might see different policies and different types of artificial intelligence research landing in different geographical areas. I'll ask a question back to the audience, which is anyone here implementing AI looking at these policies and thinking and making actions based on what's being released? No. That makes it really easy to do.
Slightly tangential question, but mainly for, I guess, Dan and Tatiana. So it's clear we need academia, we need research, but at the same time, the value proposition of a four-year degree kind of needs an update, because the industry will be completely different between the start and the end of your degree. So I guess for Dan or anyone else, how do universities need to adapt to this?
So this is a great question, to be honest. So the challenge here right now, if you want to be poor but independent, you can go to work in academia, right? So if you don't care about money, you just want to do your research independently. But the challenge here is that if you start accepting money from companies or governments, that's how you lose your independence, and that's how you are affected by, I would say, their expectations and their values and their final goals. And that's a challenge. So while I saw that some universities are trying to collaborate with enterprises, and it's really great. It's really important to, in this collaboration, to set up clear goals of this collaboration and to explain that actually the goal of research is to advance research. Sometimes it may not lead to any results, and it's okay. Yeah, I think here for universities, of course there are different levels of education, but on the research side, I think research should remain to be independent. But of course, I think companies and governments should create a space for researchers, for them to allow them to work independently and explore different applications and different angles of using these technologies, and trying to do as many experiments as possible. I think that's the future of research. But I'm really happy also to see that many companies actually have a lot of positions for research engineers, and these roles are not about, you know, solving some business problems. It's just to do research, and that's really great. Yeah, I think that these two different directions, when actually we're able to create these research units in different companies and even startups, that would be great.
I'm going to throw back so we can get another chance for an audience question. I think this one here is waiting.
Hi. I just wanted to go back a little bit on the question about regulation, and coming to your point about looking at it from a more global perspective. I think it's really important. It's interesting with this discussion. We're talking about a lot of stuff, but actually the things we're talking about are in the awareness of a very small percentage of the population of the world. However, the technologies that we're talking about are the people who are interacting with them is a huge percentage of the world, and it's growing. So my point or my question is, are you thinking more about how these technologies are impacting people on a global scale, and what questions we need to ask in terms of regulation? There are different value systems that exist in this world. There's different perspectives on what's right and what's wrong. All of these things need to be taken into consideration. So, sort of a question, sort of a comment, but I just want to add that in because I think it's really, really important. I work a lot in Africa, working with people learning technology. And a lot of people in those societies are much more vulnerable to the sort of issues that come with AI technologies. So, yeah, I just wanted to put that to the panel.
One thing I was going to say is with the regulation stuff, there is some kind of principles kind of emerging like that. You should never be using an application and be getting, you know, AI'd and it pretends like it's not AI. You should always know if you're dealing with an AI. Like there's a couple of these principles that seem to be starting to emerge. You should always know how your data is getting used, and you should have, you know, you should ask up front, you know, if you're going to use the data. And also as well, it's technology in general as well. Like, you know, before all LLMs, we had facial recognition. How's that going to be used? You know, these are kind of semi-related problems. And like, for instance, screening CVs, that's a big problem. You know, it's how us humans use these applications is sometimes the bigger problem that we need to be clear about, as opposed to like the technology itself. So some of these aren't new problems. Some of them are kind of problems we've been dealing with for the last, you know, 10 years that we still need to figure out. But yeah, in terms of the global kind of view, it's very hard for sure. Like what content is acceptable on one platform is completely different in a different country if you're going by the local laws and regulations, and it's complicated.
Just to add to that, I think also at a foundational level, it's really important to have the tools in place, or guide rails in place, so that when these foundational models are built, you can build those rule sets that govern how that they will interact with the people, and that can be regionalized and based on the various different audiences. So again, those tools do exist at the foundational level. Obviously, they need to be applied to real use to be of any use, but again, it's building up those models with those tools to ensure that they're not misused.
Awesome. Fantastic, and we're just at time. We're all around the conference, so if anyone has any more questions to come ask, these experts are here and have a conversation. I think I'd love to pick up a bit of a chat on the last subject. I think that could be quite interesting. But thank you all very much for your questions. Can we get a round of applause?